Welcome. I'm Michael Boriskin, and I am in the National Historic Landmark home of our namesake, Aaron Copland. All of us here at Copland House are so glad to have you join us for this program in our virtual series of 6 streams called Cultivated Spaces 3.0. This is the online version of our Cultivate Emerging Composers Institute, which is an annual, intensive, all-scholarship creative workshop and mentoring program for gifted composers at the initial stages of their professional careers. We began Cultivate back in 2012. We've often spoken about it bringing together our 3 primary program components: multifaceted composer support, live and recorded performances, and educational engagement and mentoring. Each year we choose 6 composer fellows, and we commission each of them to write a brief chamber work that forms the core of their activities when we bring all of them here to New York for an intensive week of rehearsals and work sessions with our Music from Copland House ensemble and Cultivate director Derek Bermel. This online series of 6 programs features the virtual premieres of all of the works by our composer fellows from this year, 2022, and has been the public face of Cultivate all during the pandemic shutdown. So a big shout out here to our media partner at I Care If You Listen for collaborating with us on this. It's really been a delight working with all of them. These virtual programs, which highlight our 2022 fellows, will continue on coming Thursdays at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and then be available indefinitely. And speaking of this pandemic shutdown, I'm very glad to introduce Paul Frucht, who has explained that his piece that we're about to hear, called What a Time, is in fact about grappling with the massive societal changes since the pandemic hit in early 2020, a time that he rightly describes as really terrifying and turbulent. Paul's going to say a few words about the piece, and then we will hear the work played by 2 of Music from Copland House's stalwart artists, cellist Alexis Pia Gerlach and pianist Margaret Kampmeier. And after the performance, Paul will be back for a brief chat with Derek. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy.
My name is Paul Frucht, and I'm the composer of What a Time, which was written in response to my experience in summer of 2021, which was the first time since the onset of the pandemic that I was able to see friends and family more freely, more safely, and resume some of life's normal activities. So as you can imagine, this was a very hopeful time. But in the midst of that hope and satisfaction of seeing friends and family and going about life's daily activities, there was still a lot of tragedy to grapple with that we'd all collectively experienced over the first year and a half of the pandemic. So the piece really addresses that, where it's a struggle really between the optimism of seeing friends and family and also dealing with the tragedy, accepting what had happened. So the piece kind of goes back and forth. The cello will play these very evocative, sometimes very deeply tragic lines, but the piano is setting this more optimistic backdrop. And the piece kind of progresses in that it grapples with this and trying to search for some type of conclusion, some type of resolution. And the piece really ends and settles on a prayer for the future, which is hopeful and yet acknowledges the tragedy that has happened. I hope you find this rewarding and that perhaps it helps you reflect on your own experience during that time. And I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Derek Bermel, and I'm the director of the Cultivate program at Copland House. And so happy to have Paul Frucht with me here to talk about your piece from this summer.
Pleasure to be here speaking with you, and it was a pleasure to participate in Cultivate this past summer.
Yeah, so what a time, right? That's your piece that we just heard, and I find it interesting that you were focused on the pandemic, both the positive and the negative aspects, kind of the hope and the despair, which makes for great music, right? Because you can it gives you your juxtaposition right there at the beginning
Yeah.
of the process. Um, do you do you see the cello and the piano as being representative of the kinds of emotions you were trying to draw, just in general?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, if you're gonna write any kind of lyrical, hopeful piece, I mean, you can't really go wrong writing for the cello. There are few instruments that are gonna bring that forth better than the cello, arguably none at all. So when I was thinking about writing something that had the kind of range of emotional communication that I wanted to take advantage of, the cello seemed like a really, really good bet.
Yeah, it's a really moving work. I mean, and it's you just kind of put it all out there. What I remember about it is this: you have this kind of descending, almost fanfare like motive that starts the piece, and then what I remember is this kind of building slowly in contrast to that. So it descends very quickly, maybe just like we all quickly descended into chaos during that time. And then the build back is very slow and agonizing, quite beautiful. Also, you have this
Thank you.
motive, dee, 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 that kind of moves up and then down and then back a little bit higher, and then it keeps reaching higher. So in contrast to the descent, the ascent is very painstaking.
Yeah, I was thinking about it more of a kind of reflection, um, um, not of not necessarily trying to describe, the descent into chaos, but more kind of reflecting on it. And it's interesting that you think of the beginning as a fanfare. I suppose it is. I wasn't thinking of it that way, but I mean that's one thing about composition and meeting other musicians that's always so interesting is people have ideas about your music that you don't even have yourself. So uh,
But we have to
what
put it
I
into words somehow, right?
right.
That's the difficult thing about music. When we talk about it afterwards, which is what we're doing now, we're thinking about how do we describe this in words, something that's almost purely emotional in its
Yeah,
quality.
yeah, exactly. But it's interesting that you thought of it as a fanfare. I was thinking of it as more of it. To me, it's a very kind of broad uh, motive, and it feels like I was thinking of I was thinking of seeing a great distance. Like if you're out in like a really spacious park. You can tell I live in New York City because I'm not saying mountains or anything else. I'm thinking just the most spacious part of Central Park, which is about the greatest distance you can see um, in New York City. But if you were on a mountain or something and you could see the sunset really far in the distance, that's what I was trying to evoke because it's a piece that's about reflection ultimately. And so the further we can see, the more we can reflect. So that's what I was trying to convey, that it's not something that was like happening right at that moment, but that was really looking far out in the distance and trying to make sense of it. And that's what that opening was trying to convey to me. But I guess that also calling it a fanfare also really very apropos as well.
Well, it's just what reminds me of what you're describing now is this. There is this quality, very American quality of these fourths, open fourths and fifths that composers like Copland used to evoke that kind of American sound in wide open spaces, which is what certainly not New York City, but the rest of America sometimes evokes.
Well, it's funny, and it's funny you mentioned actually the descending fourths and fifths that Copeland used, because I guess I was just thinking about this today actually, um, looking at when I was in school, looking at Copland's Third Symphony, and the beginning of the fourth movement, he takes the melody from takes this melody from earlier in the piece And I remember Sam Adler, when he was introducing that piece to us, describing it as that was supposed to be the soldiers coming home on the boat and seeing the United States in the distance. Um, that invoking that earlier motive with descending fourths and fifths and then seeing it off in the distance. And I thought that was just such an amazingly rich characterization of that moment in that piece. And maybe not consciously something that was inspiring me here, but definitely maybe something that's kind of just worked its way into kind of how I view approaching music.
Yeah, it's interesting that there is that always that tension with music that doesn't have words, about whether it's kind of quote unquote absolute music or whether there's some narrative that goes with it, or whether you leave the narrative to the listener to create their own narrative in a way lets them move into the piece with maybe their own interpretation, which I suppose is what everyone would like, to have the audience come to the piece in their own way. Um, so you came um, to the Cultivate program with this piece, and how did it evolve during the week? What kinds of work did you do with the performers?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing for me um, was actually realizing that there were places where I needed just a little bit more time for things to breathe, and which I think is just something, especially with narrative music, the pacing is so important, and it's something I really focus on. So I was able to really, in working with the performers and working with you, really understand, okay, there are places this piece needs to breathe. So just creating pockets of time in certain places. And then also, sort of along those lines, understanding that there were places where I had the cello playing where actually it made sense just to have the piano playing and then the cello could come in. And that created a contrast, which actually helped the clarity of the narrative. Because in any kind of chamber work, at least the way I view it, with an instrument in pianos, particularly strings in piano, there are obviously ways to mix this up, but the kind of natural roles for those instruments are the piano is going to give you the setting, and then the solo instrument, if we think of it as a solo instrument, is going to be the storyteller. And that's not to say you can't mix that up. I mean, I certainly do, but those are sort of the traditional roles. And um, and what I realized with the cello as the storyteller is sometimes I just needed to have places where the piano was where the piano was just gonna, provide the setting without the cello constantly telling the story. And that way, when the cello did come back in to move the narrative forward, um, it just made it clearer and just made the piece better as a whole.
So yeah, that's I guess that's what you were working with, was that the chance to work on the nuances of entrances and exits, and giving the piece a little bit more shape,
Yeah.
which is something we always need to do. I mean, once we have that block of marble and then we can carve away at it a little bit. It's a chance to do that, which I guess is the point of the program, to give us all a chance to carve away a little bit at that
Yeah, and
first.
just really focus on it and that sort of thing. And I found that really helpful, in just having that time. Just, okay, I'm going to focus in this unbelievably great detail on this kind of stuff, which was great. And I think the piece is, as a result, much stronger than it otherwise would have been if I hadn't had the chance to do that.
Yeah, well, it's great to have players like Alexis and Peggy, and
Yeah.
so I mean, well, thanks for the beautiful music, for the week, and for and also I should say thanks to I Care If You Listen, and thanks to the American Composers Forum for hosting this, and great to catch up with you, Paul, and look forward to what's coming next.
Thanks so much. My
Take
pleasure.
care.